would like to invite to the stage our keynote speaker for tonight. Davina Rooney is the General Manager of Sustainability and Corporate Procurement at Stockland. She is a property professional with a broad range of sustainability experience from environmental projects, not-for-profit boards, and overseas community development work. She's about to commence as the Chief Executive Officer of the Green Building Council of Australia, and she has built a reputation as a deeply insightful and collaborative leader. She's also a fellow engineer, so I would like to invite Davina to the stage.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a privilege to be here today and to join with Auckland as they have their conversation. I've had the key opportunity of being involved through my company, and I'll give you a little bit of context of our journey in this space. And I come here to give you some of the information, some of the lessons we've had along the way, so we can interpret those and discuss how they may be useful for yourself. So to give a little context, Stockland is the property group I work for. They're one of Australia's largest diversified property groups. What's fascinating about this is we build most of the key elements that make up a city. Residential, retirement living, office developments, retail, industrial. And we've actually been considering the space that we're discussing tonight of how it impacts our cities. Our largest community that we're developing is a small city, 50,000 dwellings. And when we actually start considering things at that scale, how we plan for the future and climate resilience is pretty fundamental to us. So one of the questions when people talk to me about this is they sort of say, what's your perspective in this space? And who exactly is Stockland on the global sustainability scene? So to give you a little bit of context, we're currently on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, the global property lead, on the global real estate and environmental sustainability benchmark. In our asset category, we are the global lead, and we're currently on Australia's on the A list for CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project. What does that mean? We've been spending a lot of time and work in this space for a decade, and there's a number of lessons in our journey that may be useful for consideration as Auckland takes on this very important conversation. Now, I think one of the things when we think about is how do you take on long-term journeys? I think it's very fundamental that we put sustainability at the heart of that journey. So if you actually, I'll only touch on this briefly, but if you look at my organisation's business strategy up there, the white parts are our enduring business strategy of grow asset return and customer base, operational excellence and capital strength. Now, the thing that I note is all of that strategy is enabled by sustainability progress. How do we actually work better with our customers? Well, that's always enabled by how we shape thriving communities. In every asset class, we have to fundamentally engage differently and work with our customers. So whenever we do residential developments, we actually do a long-term livability survey where we actually measure people's satisfaction with the key design elements, the community programming, and use that to inform our strategies in those areas. We're going to spend quite a lot of time tonight talking about how we optimise and innovate, which is really how we engage in making meaningful environmental change and considerations in the carbon space. Now, I think one of the things that business and government have to talk about well in this space is when we actually drive energy efficiency programs, they make fundamental business sense. You know, the company that I've had the privilege to work with has saved over $90 million in deferred bills, and actually whilst turning off the equivalent of sort of half of our portfolio in office. And if we actually look at that, this combination of efficiency and efficacy is really what we're going to actually need to drive over a longer term journey. We also have to look at how this builds to capital strength, and just to briefly touch on that, how we deliver these elements in partnership together is of the most fundamental importance. And, you know, so if we look at green financing instruments like the green bond, I'm happy to, green bonds, how we actually engage different parts of the sector in meaningful ways, that's very important. But when I talk about partners, when I look at my partners within Australia, I actually look at the key government partners that we work with. And one of the panellists before this was asking me, how do you work with your council area. What's your home council? And it was a great question because our home council is the City of Sydney, of which we were one of the founding members of the Better Buildings Partnership. And that city has a partnership where we all commit to hitting 70% by 2030 in our buildings and actually move together on that trajectory of measuring. We were part of their resilience partnership. And I think one of the key messages when we talk about the complex, difficult conversations we're working through tonight is how do you do it? Together is the answer. So I was asked a little to give some of my reflections on a long journey in this space to see if any of those lessons as we discuss them in the panel can help Auckland as they consider their journey. So for us, we've been on this journey for over a decade, and I think it all started exactly where the Auckland conversations are really evolving at the moment. How do you establish meaningful frameworks? How do you set up ways of measuring? And then as, you know, so for us, it was really started in our early days, it was about setting up the governance frameworks and the accountability metrics. As we moved a couple of years into our journey, it was all about how we set bigger targets and then held ourselves to account to achieving them, and then how we actually moved across deeply into everything we do. And I think that's really the phase that Auckland's in when they describe, you know, the climate mapping work that you've been doing and some of your climate symposiums that you've been having over the last month. And I guess for us, as we sort of move through the different phases of our journey, it's been about trying to actually take some of those small ideas and make them bigger. You know, so for us, we started with the smallest solar system you've ever seen. You know, we did that in 2011. We took that to a degree of scale, and we're currently running Australia's largest property solar rollout from one property group at this stage. Now, how you actually do that is exactly the same strategies that are being discussed here about take a meaningful piece that works, embed it in your governance, take it to scale and discuss it with your communities, and then evolve these over time. But the subject of the conversation that we're focusing on tonight is really about how we start to make meaningful impacts about climate, and then how do we actually consider the key variables that need to be discussed in these conversations. Now, whenever I actually think of starting these journeys, I think drawing down from some key international examples is really important. Sometimes people get confused when we talk about climate because they talk about metrics and targets. What are we actually going to do so that we stay within the Paris Agreement? And then how do we work on climate adaptation, or what's the strategy in the governance? And I think we're really fortunate that there's some amazing global frameworks. There's a thing called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures that effectively sets out a framework for implementation across these measures. And we're actually starting to see that encompassed around the globe at scale. Now, fascinatingly, this framework didn't come from the environmental movement. It actually came from the Financial Stability Board, a board that was set up globally to have global financial security after, you know, the financial events that we had about 10 years ago. And so I think the thing is the dialogue has changed where when we actually speak about climate resilience, and there's a fundamental global understanding that if we're going to be future focused, you know, exactly as the reflections tonight, this is where we need to start. If we're going to have any prosperity, we need to be understanding this. And just to give you a little bit of context of where I come from, we're at the point where if you don't have strategies in this space, there's a national report on investing in the dark. Australian companies still failing to disclose climate risks. And what this is fundamentally saying is if you're going to build prosperous cities and a prosperous economy, you need to have long-term planning in place to actually manage these issues. Now, I've talked a lot about frameworks, but now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our story. Now that is, and we're going to talk a little bit about this tonight, Auckland's just gone through a journey of mapping how much at risk your assets are. That's a map of ours from 2011 where we looked at how much at risk our assets were. And so tonight we're going to talk a little bit about how you actually start there and then move your assets along a different journey. Now, how did we start? As it often is the case, we started with a crisis. we had one of our far north Queensland assets had a cyclone, and very quickly one of our shopping centres became a disaster recovery facility with, very limited notice and access. Now for us, that was sort of the start of, we really need to do more work with universities. We need to fundamentally understand how we keep what we do to make sure that these assets are in the best shape possible, because when you have a disaster, the entire community becomes involved and public buildings become very engaged. We started to develop all of our disaster resilience planning, all of our key relationships across our cities to do an engagement. But one thing that was clear to us was we couldn't actually do this in one location. So we took a map of our country, of our portfolio, looked at the latest climate research, and then mapped how vulnerable our assets were. And then we did our first stage of setting a 3-year plan of where our assets are. I don't want them to be that vulnerable in 3 years. And started doing physical mapping of each location of what would it take to start to make change, and then deployed that through long-term discussions with our insurers. Now, the thing I can tell you is when we discuss this across our economy and with our insurers, our buildings are actually easier to insure and we get a lot of engagement. This form of planning that you're talking about, the thing that I would say to you is it's difficult, but it's absolutely possible. And, we achieved our target of moving those buildings' resilience to a lower point of vulnerability. Now, the next point that I'll make is everyone loves talking about climate resilience, but the reality is when we have a big disaster, it's actually about the community. So a few years later, after we'd been doing some of this framework work, we had the cyclone marsher at a place called Stockland, Rockhampton. And we've been doing quite a lot of work. We kept having we had a creek below the entrance to our asset. It kept getting washed away to current design standards. We designed to far higher standards, and then we actually had no issues at our asset, but we were the only asset functioning in the region. So we were the only ones with power. And so all of a sudden we had field hospitals in our shopping centre car park. We were the local telecommunications area. And so our focus shifted from just being about climate resilience to community resilience. Because the reality is when these transformational events happen, it's actually the community that is most impacted. And so going back to some work with my home council, the City of Sydney, they've been involved in the C40 Climate Resilient Cities. But what's been really interesting about their approach is they've started mapping not just climate vulnerabilities, but they've actually been mapping their entire community's vulnerability, because they're saying the points of climate resilience will actually be at some of the points of the highest community resilience. Now, I'm just very briefly now what does that mean? That means we actually have to start looking at, yes, the physical assets of an individual asset, but what does that fundamentally mean across our economy, and what does that mean to our supply chain, and actually start mapping those things, because if we're going to have the scale of change that we're describing, we have to be able to help all the parts of our society move. It's going to be different education programs, different support, different transport systems. And so the thing that we can't forget, and I think was sort of eloquently described earlier, is that there's opportunities in this. When we actually look at the large-scale transport planning that was referenced, and we look at electrification of your transport systems, that's only going to work if we've decarbonised the building sectors and made them a lot more efficient. Otherwise, where's the power going to come from without fundamental structural shifts? Or where are the key opportunities in the renewables sector? We've got to work through these complex issues while selling a message of hope to our communities. And the thing that that gives me the most hope is when I look at the complexity in these challenges. For all the challenges we have, there's these beacons of light on the horizon. When I have the privilege to work with the New Zealand Green Building Council, and I get to see some of the amazing programs that they're doing in the home space, which is sorely needed, or the fact that there's frameworks that are being launched that cities are signing up to where they commit to net zero by 2030, and you can sign off property portfolios. The thing is, we can't become so challenged by the things we're describing that we don't do today the things that we know need to happen. And so my final challenge point as we go into this discussion is, we're starting to see around the world rallies of children asking what action we, the grown-ups in the room, are taking on climate resilience, on the climate. There is no planet B. Now, at the moment, we know that we don't have a lot of children in this audience suite. We haven't had them demanding more renewables and better buildings. And so we know that when we do these conversations, we actually have to take all the frameworks and the great concepts and plans that we're deciding and that Auckland's deciding and make that far more of a community conversation. So I'm absolutely thrilled to be here today, to be the first panellist to start to discuss this community conversation. And I really commend Auckland for not just going to technical frameworks with boring engineers like me, but actually to turn this into a community conversation where you reimagine how you design your cities for the future. Thank you. I look forward to having a discussion with you on this fabulous subject.